In firefighting and public safety, reliability is key. For over 20 years, the Fire Store has equipped first responders with trusted gear featuring brands like MSA Carnes for helmets and Seek for thermal imaging cameras. Stay prepared. Visit thefirestore.com today. The Fire Store, your trusted safety partner.
This podcast is brought to you by Flex 7 from Tenkata Protective Fabrics. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of enforced technology. Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tenkatafabrics.com/Flex 7.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with MagnaGrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit magnagrip.com.
Welcome back to another episode of Main Street Firefighting, a podcast by Fire Engineering. My name is Shady, and with me is my partner, Chris Tobin. Before we get started, we'd again like to thank Fire Engineering for the opportunity and you all for tuning in. Tonight, we're joined again by Chief Pronesti to discuss cold storage warehouses and their fires. We hope you enjoy. Thanks again for joining us tonight for another just quick episode of the Main Street Firefighting podcast. We are joined again by Chief Pronesti out from Ohio. I want to talk about cold storage warehouses. One, it's just been something that Chris especially has been digging into recently, and then December is obviously the month that we kind of are drawn attention back to these fires again because of the Worcester fire on December 3rd. So we're going to kind of talk about that fire a little bit. It's been covered a lot in the past, but how that relates to buildings we have now and maybe why that was a little bit different of a fire than what we're typically used to. But Joe, real quick, for anyone who maybe hasn't heard the old episodes of our podcast, can you introduce yourself again real quick?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm Joe Pronesti. I'm the fire chief in a city called Elyria, Ohio, which is just west of Cleveland, in northern Ohio. Been on the job 36 years, and I'm currently in chief position. And thanks for having me.
Cool. So just real quick for anyone who maybe hasn't listened to any of the previous podcasts on the Worcester fire, there's some really good ones out there. There's a documentary that are going to tell stuff way better than we are in this short period of time. But it was a cold storage warehouse fire. Fire got away from them. They ended up getting separated from their crews, and 6 firemen died. So we kind of want to talk about what specifically with that building was different than maybe what we're traditionally used to seeing in the cold storage warehouses that we're kind of more familiar with in our area.
Well, I would say first and foremost, they were dealing with a windowless building and very limited access. I believe there was only one stairway that went from the ground floor all the way up to the 6th floor, I believe. So we're talking a building that was built, and like you said, Chris has a lot of some information on these types of buildings, but we're talking a building that was built 120 years ago, before refrigeration like you have now. Mm-hmm. You didn't go to Costco and get something out of the freezer. They had cold storage, and that's what these buildings were for. And so they were well made, thick, interior insulated walls, mostly with cork, and just can be amazed. And just think about being in a room with no windows and very little, if any, lighting.
The big thing with their buildings too was that they had heavy timber in theirs. And I don't know what it's like where you are in Ohio, Chief, but like where we're at, most of ours are all non-combustible. So that heavy timber component isn't there.
Yeah, you're not gonna find too much. The only things really limited in my area for heavy timber are going to be old Gothic churches. Mm-hmm. And at least in my city are the old Gothic churches and a few factories that remain have the heavy timber. So up in the Northeast, it's more common. But again, it was not only the heavy timber, but I think it was just the overall makeup of this giant cavernous building that had very limited exits.
Yeah.
I mean, you just don't see that.
Yeah, a 6+ story building with basically no entrance except for the first floor is a totally different ball game than most of us are used to.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Joe, when it comes to Worcester or Worcester, however you say it,
Worcester.
Yeah,
There you go.
We'll get there eventually.
hailing from the Midwest. So,
Right.
the big thing about that fire that separates it from what I would call the more common or traditional cold storage legacy warehouse building was they had, in addition to the cork insulation, which I don't want to emphasize the cork insulation because that does not behave like people think it does, first off. But secondly is because they had polystyrene insulation in addition to the cork insulation, in addition to a honeycomb layout, which is also abnormal. In addition to the fact that it was a hybrid heavy timber and fire resistive building in the sense that it was in the legacy of fire resistant. So it was the first two floors, I believe, were concrete floors. Think of a parking garage. And then the subsequent floors were heavy timber with a combustible roof. So I couldn't, from all the research I did, and I really went deep into the research, that is an atypical design. Now, those things would have been common in certain percentages kind of across the country. Say if we step back in time 100 to 120 years, you'd see variance in that. That wouldn't be uncommon. What makes that fire uncommon is that what's left of those buildings out there, however many dot the landscape in North America, that is a very atypical setup. They find all those things in that building. Did they have polystyrene on top of cork? Yeah, obviously that was a thing, especially after they've been remodeled. In this case, this building, obviously had that happen in the 60s and 70s and the 80s. I'm not really sure of when that building actually went vacant. But they didn't have polystyrene on the walls back in, 1898 or 1910. So that was something that was kind of weird. That added a whole, think of combustible furnishings. We like Coconut Grove, right? Like it took a Coconut Grove, smash it into a building with no windows, and then smash it inside of a heavy timber element. Yeah, you can see like this was once you really get down deep into what kind of fire this was, it was an insane amount of adversity. It was just messed up, and there's no way for anyone on scene or anyone to have known that. It was just the odds of success were just almost impossible. So,
well, one thing that when you read about the incident and get into it, one of the things that the firefighters said was that the smoke, when it went bad right now. So that I would blame that probably a lot on that styrene, on the zero visibility. They said that the smoke was just black as can be and oily.
I gotta imagine once that started going, it just removed all ability to operate. Yeah.
Right. And there was no furniture. It was just walls, and that's what took off and led to the zero visibility. There was very little, for lack of a better term, stuff in this building. It was just open floors. So that I think had to have taken them by surprise.
Well, and the other thing we talk about before, but it's easy to forget, is like a small fire, what appears like a small fire, a small amount of smoke in a large building is going to be a large fire anywhere else. So then once they start to rapidly increase after that, then you're looking at a whole different ball game that you weren't expecting.
Yeah, one of the things that took me by surprise is that when the crews went up to the roof, there was a vent shaft or whatever.
Mhm.
And when they opened that shaft, they said it was like a chimney, that they had good ventilation where they had the smoke and heat just funneling right up out of this shaft. So that shaft provided them what they were looking to do.
Mm-hmm.
And venting the building, it's just the makeup of those walls and just the typical environment that created that zero visibility and to be able to move around in there in wide open areas. It was a big box. It was a big box on top of a big box.
Right, and
On
imagine
top of a
that.
big box.
Imagine that vent hole, while producing a good amount of smoke, probably with the massive size of that building, was probably, just a pinhole to what the fire needed.
Right. Absolutely. I think one thing that I want to really get out of this podcast for the listeners, and I'm sure we'll get into it towards the end, is that, it doesn't have to be, I think one of the reasons why, this fire sometimes gets lost for a generation of firefighters is exactly what Chris had mentioned, that this is an atypical building. You don't see these too much in the Midwest anymore. It's, Northeast. So, firefighters, I knew a younger firefighter, and you have an entire generation now come on the job since this tragedy. Is that, well, okay, I don't have that building, but you have to take into all the little things that they encountered. You can encounter the wide open space, the interior walls made of modern materials. Just because you don't have a cold storage warehouse in your district or in your city or whatever, this building just had all the bad things all piled up in one building. And the lessons that you can take away, all kinds of different lessons, and apply them to your community. Another one is, for me, is air consumption.
Yeah.
You have a giant building and, think of a big box. So I take the lessons from Worcester and the air consumption, just that one takeaway, air consumption. Well, how does it affect me in my city? Well, I got big boxes.
Mm-hmm.
And try walking from, one of the things that I say is, go to a big box, mask up, go on air, and walk from the front all the way to the back. And see how much air you use, just going from one end to the other. And think about that. Now start doing stuff. Start breathing heavy. Start stretching lines. Start doing all these things. And it's amazing how quickly you can start, losing air and using up your air.
And now we have our low air alarms or passive devices going off, at that 30%, 33%. And
Right.
people tend to ignore it a little bit because they are used to being able to, now I have more air, so I can ignore it for a little bit. And then you get working in a big building like that, and you've ignored it for a second, and then you've ignored it for a little bit longer, and suddenly now you're almost out of air because you've gotten in the habit of ignoring something that's supposed to indicate for you to go out. You know what I mean? So those are all kind of bad habits that we pick up on in a residential building, that if you're not disciplined in a big building like that, can be really, really detrimental.
Right. Well, not only that, but I think and while we're learning more and more, and I think we've become more and more disciplined against doing it, but you work in a residential and your bell starts to ring, and okay, well, I'm going to take my mask off. I know where it's starting to lighten up here, or I'm going to work a little longer, and because the stairs are right there, I know how to get out, and you get that false sense of security going to the everyday house fire. Well, now you're in this giant box and you don't think of these things. And you're right. Now your alarm is going at 33%. So yeah, it's something you don't face a lot, but when you do, you have to think so much differently when you're talking a commercial building.
Absolutely. So, Chris, you guys had you had cold storage building fire over the summer a couple times. Do you want to talk about some of the stuff that they kind of found with that? Maybe especially with the search stuff. We've been talking a lot about the unhoused population. It's getting cold out. We're all starting to see them in every building like this. So what is something that you guys have tried to do to mitigate the issues with searching for that?
So cold storage warehouse fires in St. Louis are actually not uncommon in the sense that it's like a once in a career fire. Unfortunately, these buildings do a couple things that no other building allows you to do. It allows for prolonged offensive operations. I'm talking in some case hours of interior firefighting. Hours. The way they're put together, think of a parking garage surrounded by four 18-inch thick brick curtain walls, and nothing's going to collapse on you anytime soon. And the fires are never to the magnitude to compromise the structure per se, from what we think about as a residential perspective. So you're in there for a long time. Not only does that set itself up, the other big unique thing about these buildings is multiple fires are almost always the norm. Meaning you might have a 30-year chief that shows up on scene and they can recall 10 or more fires in the previous career they've been at in that building. And then here we are again for the second or third or fourth time, in our case with the last one, in the span of a week, 2 major times that month, always multiple alarm fires. So no other building allows that. And when I mean you're going interior on these things for hours, there's no exaggeration. We're talking hour bottles start to become a thing. Search ropes are non-negotiable. We definitely show up to these buildings. By these buildings, I mean the handful of cold storage warehouse we have left, which, like I was just saying, we have all had fires in, knowing exactly what is about to occur, that the odds are stacked against us. They're not going to be easy, and it's 50-50 at best. What's even crazier about that is we've had the cold storage warehouse fire with the report of 2 vagrants inside. I mean, it was literally, flashback, right? And then our ending was much better. They did rescue 2 vagrants from the second floor. It was off grade. So the first floor to the vagrants turned out to be the second floor to the, on one side of the building. So they were hanging out. They were cut off. So, like Lex was alluding to, the homeless population tends to set up the homeless camps inside these cold storage buildings. For all the same reasons, they're great at keeping stuff cold. They also keep everything warm in the wintertime. And they usually set up those encampments near the entrance. They got cut off from fire. They ran towards the wall and then found themselves 2 floors off grade. So rescued 2 out of there. But so yeah, happy ending to that. But once again, the fire went, and seems like it always does what it does in these, and it's just it jumps from floor to floor and all of a sudden now you have 3 or 4 floors of fire above you, and you have no idea how did that happen. How there's nothing in these buildings. What's going on? So
Right.
And you're pretty limited from even seeing that that's there due to the lack of windows.
no idea right there. So reading smoke, pun intended, goes out the window. Like there is no way to read the smoke on these buildings. There are the little bit that I've picked up from watching these fires, because they burn for days, and we go back to them over and over again throughout that course of time, into where you think the companies have it under control. We'll go into a mop-up overhaul phase. They'll strike back in service, and all of a sudden, a company on what we call a plugging detail, a wetting down operation, will strike a full box or a first alarm subsequently a day later, because they've discovered an entire floor of fire that just happened. Unbeknownst to anyone on the outside, maybe some of the smoke started to get kind of weird. But it's crazy how well these buildings hide anything from the outside. So it really limits any sort of outside 360 size up indicators. You're looking for pinholes of smoke coming through mortar joints. Burnt mortar scars would be the biggest one that I've picked up on. that would indicate some sort of prolonged burning against that wall, creeping in the cork insulation. And when I mean burning in the cork insulation, I do not mean the cork actually is what's burning. Anyone who's done research in these buildings, cork does not burn. If you don't believe me, go light some wine corks on fire. You won't have anything happen. We've put the insulation under blow torches. It doesn't do what you think it does.
You guys were pretty surprised by that, actually, when you tried it out.
Super surprised. We can go to these warehouses today, go get the cork, bring it back to the firehouse, play around with it. It does not burn up like you'd think it does. What does burn in these buildings is the asphalt backing that they put on the cork or impregnate the cork with as a moisture barrier on the first layer, meaning the brick wall on the inside of the building, that first layer where the brick is inside the building gets a layer of asphalt, and then it's cork, and then it's usually plaster, and then cork, and then plaster, then cork. So you have that going on, and it's just that layer of asphalt that's what's actually the flammable element, not the cork by itself. Very important for
you basically have gasoline siding.
Yes.
We're talking asphalt siding. So that asphalt, instead of being in the exterior of a residential or commercial building, you have that on the interior.
Correct. Yeah.
It's supposed to go.
No wonder you have fire spread when you have that asphalt also dripping, right? So everything's heating up and some of that stuff's burning, and then you have that asphalt dripping that you can't get to either.
So something else that, unbeknownst to me, there is a floor wall gap in these buildings. No other building has anything like this that I've ever found. It's called concrete skeleton construction, is what the name of it actually is. There's only one source out there on this stuff. It's one book written by a man in 1915. So, great cross sections, by the way, in that book.
For people listening, you have photos, don't you?
Yeah, sure.
Throw that up on the website link with this so people can kind of see what he's talking about, so it makes a little more sense.
But anyways, that gap between the floor. All right, so think of a balloon frame building and all the reasons why a balloon frame building spreads fire in really bad ways. Now, even a balloon frame structure, a balloon wood frame structure, has stud bays. So it really limits the fire going horizontally, right? You're only spreading fire vertically. To an extent, it stays in those stud bays. A cold storage warehouse with this type of construction is actually more balloon frame than an actual balloon frame house in the context of it has no horizontal limitations at all. It is 4 freestanding walls with a 12 to 18 inch gap in between the floor and the inside of the exterior wall where the insulation would be. So once the insulation falls out or you're just there, you have a gap. You can literally step your foot down in between the wall and the interior floor space if that insulation happens to be missing. So think about what that does to fire. This is the only building you'll ever come across that has bidirectional, meaning horizontal and vertical fire spread unimpeded from basement to the roof. I've never seen anything else like that anywhere. And I didn't know that that's how these buildings were built. So I started doing the research and talking to some guys who have fought quite a few of them. So something that I guarantee almost none of the fire service knows about, not in the books. And it's kind of one of the things you pick up on from doing it. But
well, the other thing that you touched on, that cities, large and small, are seeing an uptick in homelessness or vagrants. And so when you arrive at a building like this and you have a very light smoke condition or, because you can't really tell, like you said, what you got going on, and you start the process of searching, things can turn so bad in such a quick period of time. But we are going to go in there and based on conditions, and you're going to do a search. And
sure.
So things can and that's what happened here. In Worcester, they were told that there was people in the building.
Right.
Or they knew that there was people in the building, and it turned south so fast because of the construction, and exactly what Chris was saying as far as the walls and the buildup of those walls, the makeup of that, the asphalt and the cork and the gaps that spread that fire so quickly unimpeded.
And I could be wrong on the numbers exactly, but if I remember correctly, at least two of the firefighters were found within 150 feet of the door. They just couldn't make their way back to it.
It was, and the conditions when they were trying to get them to get back to that stairwell. So they were thinking, in theory, that they, like you said, they were so close to that doorway. But they were right there. And to think about how, like, there's only that we mentioned one stairwell.
Mm-hmm.
One stairwell in this building. It wasn't made for occupants to be moving around to go shopping. It was storage.
Mhm.
They didn't have all the stairs that you would expect, or access. Plus, you had 100 years of conversions and changes, and even though it was a cold storage warehouse, there were different things throughout the years that were changed in there on the inside.
Yeah, so back to search ropes, and like I said, what we've kind of done, especially when we get one of these buildings that is on fire numerous times in a short span, we may be the same crew on that fire, so they kind of, I wouldn't say we don't have an SOG specifically for this, but you kind of have like an informal game plan. We're like, all right, guys, same building again. So you start to learn, right? Like the subsequent fires always seem to go smoother than the first time. After there's been a gap for like 2 or 3 years, we haven't had that fire. So the search ropes definitely come off the truck pretty quick. Like I said, the hour bottle conversation usually comes up, but we usually don't creep into the hour bottles. And that's not really like a go-to thing. That's more of an afterthought kind of thing. But the search ropes are definitely a go-to non-negotiable aspect. And a lot of times we're not on rope doing searches for people. They're on rope doing searches for the fire, because the way these fires present themselves, it's like it's very unlike the polystyrene. We don't have that element that in the ones that we have here. It's just smoldering charcoal type, gray haze. It's definitely heavy smoke depending on what part of the building it's in, but it's more we're trying to figure out where the fires are at, because these fires never start in the insulation. They never. That's not how these work. There's always the initial. Usually it's a vagrant or some sort of process that starts these fires. Human behavior. There's the main fire, be like more of a rubbish fire, or the contents aspect of this fire. That's usually pretty evident right on arrival, probably somewhere on a lower floor. That's usually what's fire showing is the contents. But the fire that we're chasing is the stuff creeping in the walls, the ceiling, and the floors. And that's another thing that people don't realize. It's not just cork in the walls. It was everywhere. It was the cork in the floor, the cork on the ceiling, in the columns. Every square inch of this places had to be insulated when you start reading about how they were actually built. So
certain areas had more than others depending on what it was storing.
Absolutely.
So it varies per floor.
Yeah, and these fires are just so crazy. So if it was like a southern wall that maybe saw the sun hit that wall, the insulation on that wall would have been thicker than a wall that didn't have the sun on it. Certain floors that had like the dairy products stored, they would put porcelain on the insides in addition to all the cork, just so that the products didn't pick up like the taste of the smell of the warehouse, like butter and stuff like that. And there were parts of the warehouse that had wood paneling sometimes, in addition to the cork behind it. So now you have a combustible furnishing. So all these crazy options that you can have in these buildings that really, like you had already said, we're not talking like furniture here. We're not, it's wide open space. So
when there were some areas for office space too, so you do have these random areas that are cut up for that. And like Chief said earlier, the longer these buildings are around, the weirder they get, the more they change. So it's just hard to predict what you're going to find where.
So the big thing with the search rope is we're pretty good at getting them out early in the incident, because we already know we're gonna have to go looking for the fire for the overhaul stage of it a lot of times, or just the discovery phase of it when we have like a light smoke ignition from the outside. But we generally try not to go more than 200-foot sections, meaning 400 feet typically, because we don't want to out search our hose line capability. And that's something else that if you have these in your city or your area, and I don't mean city meaning like the urban, these could exist anywhere. This was not these warehouses weren't just an urban city thing.
We've seen them in multiple small towns. Now, they're definitely less common than they used to be, but I can name off several small towns that we've seen them in.
I mean, I'll put it to you this way. If there was a place that had to keep food cold before 1920, you are open to having one of them in your area,
especially in a rail town along a rail line.
Yeah.
So, anyways, you need to get out and pre-plan these. People need to get out and pre-plan these, understand how they're getting lines in certain places on the upper floors. Like you said, lines over ladder. Well, that's not going to work, right? I mean, sometimes the fastest way might be going to the roof and down a stairwell. That's what, so it could be something like that. Aerial standpipes, all that kind of stuff comes into play from the outside. The only differences between like an urban cold storage warehouse and maybe a rural suburban cold storage warehouse would be like height. Typically don't see the 5 and 6 story ones out in the rural settings. Typically you're going to see in the smaller towns like maybe 2 or 3 stories. So, and that's another thing too, is you don't go in and it doesn't look like cork hanging on the wall. People think like cork means corkboard. That's not how it looks. They parged over it with thin set cement, essentially. So you're going to walk into a building you think is just a old warehouse with cement walls, and that's really not what you have until there's a fire creeping behind it and somehow gets into the insulation, and now you're wondering what the heck is going on because stuff's not making sense. So that's also something to think about. I don't think people realize sometimes they have these and they just don't think they just don't know that they do.
So, Chief, kind of, we like to keep it short, kind of wrapping this up here. From a chief's perspective specifically, you get dispatched to one of these fires, you roll up. What are the first, handful of things that you're considering that you're going to have your guys do? What's your initial thought plan from like that command perspective?
Well, I think addressing it from you have to slow down a minute and really size up. And that's where the pre-planning comes into play, obviously. But if not, you got to slow down here a little bit and think about, number one, how are you going to access the interior of this building? Where are the stairwells? The other thing I'm doing right away is I'm getting a roof report. You got to get somebody up under the roof and to either assist you in ventilation, check these shafts. You got to get somebody up on the roof of these. At least I am right away. And like Chris had said, if you are going and you are doing a search, you got to have the search rope. But like you said too, you need a search rope not just for search, but sending people in to try to find the fire. The big one for me though is to slow down. And the other one, I'm not going to have crews necessarily, obviously they'll be on a search rope, but accountability is going to be huge. And to make sure the company officers they know where their people are at. The one thing that kind of, the larger cities, they split their crews. And, in this particular fire in Worcester, they split. That's what they do. That's nothing wrong. I get it. That's what they do. But the accountability has to be there, and to know where your people are at. But I think roof report, slow down, slow. I also am an advocate bigger lines, but. How fast can you get a flying standpipe in service? Or, you're going to have to use couple 100 feet of hose and gated wise, or you got to just start stretching, 3, 4, 5, 600 feet in these buildings. These are all things that you have to consider and get the manpower there. If you're from a smaller department and you have a light smoke condition, don't think that is going to be, well, this is nothing. You need to get resources there, because once you commit and things start to go south, you'll be playing catch up. You're never going to you got to have a reserve of people there within the first few minutes, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, good point on the hose is that's something that is also an atypical kind of flow chart with the hose line selection. Typically, we say, big building, big line, which sure, great. That usually works. In this case, it might be the time to kind of break that kind of, flow chart with that. Like you just said, how fast can you get a 2.5 or 3-inch line into play inside one of these buildings?
Right.
And here's another one that people don't realize too, is the interior operation of a blitz fire or like a ground monitor, whatever that looks like on your department. I mean, that is something that is definitely underutilized in large interior commercial settings. And in fires like this, we know that like I said, the initial fire, if you want to dry line, a 2.5 or something like that, great. I mean, and then if you have a deck on, or not deck on, but a ground monitor or a blitz fire on the end of that, let that eat. And then, man, the next 2 or 3 lines, try to get those to be the fast mobile kind of support lines. So that kind of breaks the trend of, if you're moving a 2.5 into a building, it's usually the same line or larger is your subsequent lines. In this case, that would be backwards, to where you want get that first line, get the most water at the front end, get a defensive kind of front made in these buildings, whether you're holding a choke point like a fire door, you're holding a stairwell, and then you're going to have to get above it quick before it really gets into the insulation. And that's where, instead of stretching an additional 2.5 or an additional large line, that's where I would say get your 1 3/4, your smaller hand lines. I know it sounds crazy, but I would almost say get some booster lines going in service. You got the big line right there. You're not operating independently with a small line. You're in adjacent to a large line. Essentially,
You're not going to be allowed to go far into the building, because we all know our booster lines aren't long. So you're be hitting spot fires essentially right in the entrance.
The way these fires work, people don't understand how these fires work. You're not worrying about flashovers necessarily. That's not what happens here. You're almost overhauling and extinguishing simultaneously. So unless there's large amounts of stock on fire, which would create, an actual flashover potential or something like that, when the fire's just in the insulation and running the cork and all that, it's not that. We're not worrying about necessarily a heat element. We're not worrying about a flame front or a flashover. It's mostly, like you've already said, it's air management and just trying to outpace the fire where you can't get it.
Right.
So,
well, you almost think of it like you are it's almost like, I don't know how, like blown in insulation type of fire, where you just have this big giant snarl of smoldering, nasty smoke. Put a 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 fold of that. That's what you have in this. You don't have this monster inferno of fire right away.
Right, correct.
And so it's a smother. I wouldn't even want to say a smoldering or smothering. I guess it
kind of is. I would say, right. Like it's never. You talk to the guys that have fought these numerous times, and no one's ever worried about no one's ever worried about like a flashover potential. It's just not that. Now it is hot. It's hot because it's more the thermal radiation feedback is why it's warm.
That insulation's going to work the same for heat as it would for cold.
Right.
So the more it burns and the hotter it gets in there, it's just going to hold that heat. Plus there's no windows or anything to let that heat out. So you're just sitting in an oven.
Yeah, essentially it's like an oven like that. So it's a super peculiar kind of firefighting. Like I said, hours. It goes on and on and on because the fire is never big enough to really push you out. And it's always big enough to you obviously you can get in there. It's small enough to where you're able to fight it from the inside, but it's not big enough to either fail the structure, and it's not big enough to really be like a flashover, backdraft, smoke explosion potential. You know what I mean? So it's just this ebb and flow of just like this. It sounds weird, but like almost like an aggressive overhaul kind of firefight. And it usually doesn't, if you don't get it within the first, hour or so, and it gets usually 1 or 2 floors ahead of you, we normally don't save it, and we go into master stream operation, which brings me to another point.
I mean, if you don't get it with a combustible roof,
sure, yeah, right.
You're going to have a big 4-sided box that you're going to have a firebox,
absolutely,
basically that you're going to have to get, and that's what they, when they withdrew their firefighters and said, okay, we can't afford to lose any more. It burned quite a while. It burned through the night in Worcester. And so, the other quick takeaway we were talking about, I wanted to get this point out that when you have these buildings and you have maybe homeless people in there, one of the best resources that I found is the police department. Your police departments with these kind of buildings, unless you're going there as fire department on EMS calls or just traveling back and forth, or you see the signs of homelessness, your police department knows where the homeless people pretty much are or where they'll congregate, especially in a smaller or mid-sized town. Utilize them. Ask them where these populations are. It gives you a little bit of recon ahead of time to know, and especially if we're getting into we're in the cold season. But again, you better be thinking about it. Homeless people are getting inside. They're going to get inside, and now that they get out of the elements, and so you have to be cognizant of that population being in these buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what people don't realize when you're talking commercial buildings, especially these that vagrants are in them. We're not doing like holistic whole building searches like we would in a residential setting. These are very targeted, and knowing all that on the front end is huge on the back end when it's on fire. To know you're not just free scanning on rope and sweeping massive patterns. That's just not what we do. We know where they're at. Typically, we know what part of the building we're going to target, and then that's how those searches progress. Because we haven't talked about all the open shafts and pits yet either. So that's, and then, I mean, that's the only silver lining to missing stairwells in these buildings, which a lot of times the stairs are steel stairwells, but they're obviously they're wood risers and wood treads, and those are missing or just rotted out. Usually that keeps obviously any vagrants from going to the upper floors. So we typically only have to worry about what's on the ground floor accessible level.
Well, right. And I found that if they're bringing in, let's say, bedding or, those kind of things, they're not going to be as apt to drag it up 6 floors or 5 floors or 4 floors. They're going to, for the most part, make their home on the first floor or second floor or closer, in the same usual areas, like you said, by the exits, because they are bringing in items. They are, unless they totally want concealment to get away and go higher up. But when the stairs are gone or they've been stripped for money and those kind of things, yeah, you can kind of, it's just like anything else, search-wise. If you don't know, okay, you got to guess.
Yeah.
And you got to come up with an educated guess. I pull up to a residential dwelling, I got to make an educated guess on where the master bedroom might be. If the kid's yelling and screaming, my mom and dad are inside or whatever, those kind of things. You have to make that educated guess.
Yeah, I mean, the main takeaway is we don't want to be putting guys up on rope, injuring them, falling down shafts, or getting them lost on 5 floors that, quite frankly, hasn't had a human on it in, 80 years. So, I mean, like you said, know your targeted search, know your priority search areas in these buildings. And I think most places that have these, whether they're cold storage or not, kind of know where to target in these searches. So yeah, if anything, a big takeaway this time of year is kind of know where those areas are at in the building.
And once again, we're back to getting in your buildings. And
Yep.
I would say even more so like this time of year. Like it's cool if you walk them in the summertime or spring or whatever, but when we interviewed, the people who were living in these buildings over the summer, or it was kind of like early fall, they said there's a move-in season. They actually used that phrase, and they were talking about moving into warehouses. So a warehouse that you may have walked through in, let's say May, and then you looked at it again in August, maybe didn't have anybody in it. But now that we're working into December and it's getting colder more frequently, now there may be people in that one. So I think it's kind of important to, once it starts getting cold, really get out there, use that as a chance to even just drive around, walk around the outside of the building, look for modes of getting in, whether it's, like I said, cold storage or any kind of warehouse. This is the time that you're going to find somebody in there. So this is the time that we really need to be out looking at them.
I'm going to bring up one other little thing with that, with the police and searching that I found. When you have these kind of buildings, and whether it's your city or whatever your representatives, that, they get an open door or broken windows. And for the most part, I found that police, law enforcement will not, maybe years ago, or even as little as 3 or 5 years ago, they would search that vacant building. They would send officers in, do a search at 3 a.m, and there's nobody in here. Okay, it was just a broken window. Now with the I have found, at least in my town, is that the buildings that may not be safe, but we've told the police, hey, these buildings aren't, building isn't safe. When they have that open window or door that's open jar, they're not as apt to just go ahead and do a search of this big giant building.
Yeah.
They'll call the representative if they have one, say, hey, come board up the building. And so homeless people, they know that. And so that they know that there may not be, 12 police officers running into this building to search it because there's an open door.
Well,
It's vacant.
and frankly, I mean, the police department, just like the fire department, unless someone's calling complaining because there's a broken door or window or something on their building, they don't have time. They don't care. They have other things that they're having to do. So yeah, for a multitude of reasons, they're not doing it either. So yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and the people that are in these buildings inhabiting know that.
Yep.
So they're not going to be as apt to, hey, we're leaving, the police are here. They know that.
Absolutely. Well, I think this is a good place to wrap this up. There's so much more with these buildings that you could talk about. But I would say if you want to follow up, get more on this, go on to Fire Engineering. There are a ton of really good articles. There is a Mayday Monday from a few years ago with information on the fire. Kind of gives you a rundown of what happened. Like Chris said, there's the book that talks about the specific type of construction. I'll put all the links to tag all of that up there if you want to kind of see more of what he's talking about with that skeleton construction. But any more thoughts, Chief, before we wrap this up?
Yeah, real quick. If you want to do some research on your phone, I want you to do a couple things. Number one, there's a book written about this fire called 3,000 Degrees. Mm-hmm. And it was written by a gentleman, did a story basically on the firefighters and what took place. Buy that book or download it. The other one is, if you're a company officer or above or a chief officer, I want you to type in your search engine, Chief Michael McNamee. He was the Worcester chief, not chief of the department. He was the district chief in charge of that ship, that firefighters, that basically said no more. And if you Google him, you'll find a lot of information about him. Put his name into YouTube, Mike McNamee.
He does a really good interview. I don't remember who did it.
I believe it was it's on YouTube. If you just type in, there's also the Fire Engineering, 30 Fires That You Should Know, from Frank Lieb and Chief Goldfeather. There is a whole section on their website. So there's 30 fires you should know. If you don't buy the book, if you just Google it, there's a website that has all kinds of information on these fires that's free. And there's a link to Worcester and I think some of those interviews. But if you're a firefighter wasn't born or wasn't alive or wasn't on the job when this fire took place, research it, and you owe it to the service and those that went before you and those that sacrificed to learn about that fire. And thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Chief. And like I said, we hope you at least follow up and get a little bit out of this. And everybody have a good night.
In firefighting and public safety, reliability is key. For over 20 years, the Fire Store has equipped first responders with trusted gear featuring brands like MSA Carnes for helmets and Seek for thermal imaging cameras. Stay prepared. Visit thefirestore.com today. The Fire Store, your trusted safety partner.
This podcast is brought to you by Flex 7 from Tenkata Protective Fabrics. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of enforced technology. Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tenkatafabrics.com/Flex 7.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with MagnaGrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit MagnaGrip.